A part of Fiat's restructuring processes for the Indian market includes bringing in key brands from their big bouquet. So while Ferrari takes care of the halo part of the portfolio, Jeep participates in the booming genre of SUVs, and taking on the German luxury brands is this, Maserati. And the one that we are driving today is the Ghibli. Its name comes from an African wind and has been used earlier in Maserati's illustrious history for a 2+2 Grand Tourer, followed by a sporty 2-door 4-seater coupe. In its new form, it's a proper 4-door coupe that takes on the likes of the Audi A7, the BMW 6 Series Grand Coupe and the Mercedes-Benz CLS. They all look beautiful with their long dimensions and sloping roof lines, but the Ghibli looks gorgeous. Like most Maseratis, this one too blends elegance with sports car inspired lines. You can practically reduce its profile to 3 lines, one that defines the long low-slung nose, one that highlights the surfacing of the doors, and the third that gives the car its curvaceous haunches. The design then is unmistakably Italian. Getting such a low-slung nose on a sedan is not an easy task, and then flanking it with headlights inspired by the current crop of Ferraris just adds the right amount of attitude on that smart face. So when you see the frowning face of the Ghibli, you expect a screaming Italian V8 motor under the hood, shrieks and maybe fire-breathing snarls coming out of that exhaust system. This design is racy and fast. However, I think the Ghibli looks better when it's slowly arriving down a street or gently cruising on the highway. It looks very elegant, exuding that sense of power without really shouting it out. New engine under the hood also seems to sort of agree with that approach. It's a sensible diesel motor, which in itself is a new deal for Maserati. It isn't exactly a power monger, but with 600 Newton meters on tap, it always ensures that there is adequate amount of power as and when required. But by that, I don't mean that it's too composed or laid back. In fact, it builds up pace quite rapidly when needed, and the 8-speed gearbox is quite responsive too, in the city, on the highway and around the twisties. The steering column mounted paddle shifters are the icing on the cake in form and function. The healthy torque also makes it quite fuel efficient if you are easy on the throttle. But while the engine and the gearbox are quite responsive for a diesel, the drivetrain doesn't quite have the sense of rush like a BMW does with its 3-litre oiler. In our tests, the Ghibli diesel managed to hit the turn from standstill in 6.9 seconds, which is a click slower than what the Jaguar F-Pace managed with all that crossover bulk. So this one comes across as a sensible car and a very calculated one in its approach. Now that holds true for the engine and the design of this car, where everything seems perfect. But the moment you get inside the car, you get a sense that things were rushed. The car was rushed or maybe built on a very tight deadline. The infotainment system, for example. The OS seems like it came from a car that was a decade old. It's a touchscreen system, but the user interface is like the old generations of smartphones. Even the phone icon uses the picture of a phone with a stick-out antenna and a physical keypad. The reversing camera is quite low-res too. The steering-mounted controls are a bit quirky, and not once could I hit reverse in the first go, for the selector loves slotting into park instead. These rough edges or outdated equipment are unforgivable in today's age and at this price point. But I do appreciate the design, the simple design, the elegant design of the dashboard. Everything feels nicely laid out. I like the materials, they feel quite rich. I even love the paddle shifters. They are mounted on the steering column so they don't move around with the steering wheel, and I love the way they feel. The cabin in itself, not as roomy as some of its rivals, but it's a comfortable place to be in. It's a 4-seater at best with that tunnel console running and the transmission tunnel in place. It's not a 5-seater like Maserati claims, but all 4 seats are quite comfortable on the highway, in the city, and even around the twisties. And speaking of twisties, the Ghibli loves them. The car employs a stiffer suspension setup in a conscious effort to make sure that you get a sports car feel even from its sensible sedan form. The handling is not very precise, but displays the typical character of a rear-wheel driven car, and you can literally feel the rear wheels pushing the chassis forward. You realize that all of Maserati's stability systems are working overtime to keep the car on the intended line, and that is what makes it a fun driver. The protruding wheel arches also act like judgment points to know where the 4 corners of this long car are, and that is certainly handy when the Ghibli starts dancing wildly around bends. The front feels a tad floaty, but the hydraulic steering is responsive and loves chatting away to glory. Our tester also came with the optional skyhook suspension, which adds adaptive dampers to the mix and lets you choose a softer setup for a relatively comfortable ride. But even on the latter, the ride is a bit firm, much like what you would expect on a sporty sedan. Add to it the low ground clearance and you have a car that needs you to tread cautiously over speed humps. Want to commute in a rush? Don't take out the Ghibli. Add to it the fact that the Ghibli doesn't have the best sound insulation in the class, so you hear all sorts of noises from the suspension, the road, the tires. Now generally in a luxury car of this price point, I wouldn't really appreciate that sort of a thing. However, somehow in the Maserati Ghibli, I do tend to like it. The cabin feels alive, it feels more communicative. I know it's a ridiculous thing to say with this sort of noise insulation, but somehow that's the kind of feeling that it imparts. The cabin also fills up with this really nice, tempting sound. Come on, it's coming from a diesel. In fact, there's no way to tell that this is a diesel motor apart from that tacho which redlines at about 4,500 RPM. There are no badges anywhere, there is no sort of stamping on the engine cover. There's no diesel clatter from the engine either. The Ghibli therefore achieves a very good balance between handling dynamics that you would expect from a Maserati while adding the practicality of a diesel for a country like India, making this Maserati the most sensible one that you can put your money on. In fact, the Ghibli is so sensible that Fiat gave it the responsibility of bringing in numbers for the Maserati brand, helping it achieve the target of 50,000 units per annum. But at the same time, Fiat gave it a price tag that commands a premium over the German rivals so as to not dilute the Maserati brand, which is something that I understand. But by the time it comes to India, it arrives to the Indian shores via the Sea-View route, that little premium gets magnified into a huge margin, making it so expensive that it moves from the bracket of the A7 or the 6 Series into the territory of the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. So at that price, would I still want a sensible Maserati? Well, Ghibli Diesel, no thank you. I would rather have your petrol-powered, wilder sibling, the Maserati Ghibli S. A sports saloon that has the go, sound and bragging rights of a Maserati and a 410 PS twin-turbo V6 engine that is assembled and fine-tuned by Ferrari. That is the kind of Maserati I would rather put my money on.